There are urban legends in every corner of the world. Whether it's a shelter on the outskirts of town, a creature living in a nearby forest, or a ghost walking down a deserted suburban road, the stories always have something in common. No one has been to these places, seen the creatures, or observed the demons with their own eyes. Every generation, brother, best friend, or sister knows someone who climbed a 13-story building that used real blood, snakes, and spiders, and was so terrifying that no one lived to see the end. The same people will believe these stories without any proof or the name of anyone to back up the claims, because everyone around them knows it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass these stories on to their children, who will transform them in a way that keeps them fresh. The cycle continues. I, like many others, doubt these stories because in my youth I was like an addict, seeking out scare stories about whatever part of the country I was living in at the time. I created and circulated stories about pizza parlors in New York City, my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or my grandfather's encounter with a wild humanoid demonic creature in the woods of Colorado. The only rule I broke in these stories was that I wrote them myself. Looking back, I realized that this gave me a lot of courage, because I had to believe that I always told the same story the same way. No wonder no one called me dirty. I think I contributed to the various urban legends of the Midwest and Northeastern states. I moved around a lot. As I walked the school hallways and heard a classmate telling my stories to another friend, I felt a great joy, like a big game of telephone. I knew, of course, that these stories were complete fiction, but when asked about them, I stood up. I could even make things up a bit, sound unsure, or look scared when I told about a situation I made up. I think it was this aspect of my childhood that led to my current weight, which I will share in full, no matter what you guys want from it. I'm dropping this little introduction first and foremost for those who doubt my story. Over the years, I've looked like the boy who cried wolf, but I can assure you with all the honesty and candor I have now that the wolf is real. As you may have guessed from my introduction, I traveled the country a lot when I was in middle school and high school. Neither of my parents served in any branch of the military. They were not in the habit of staying in one place for long periods of time. I guess that must have influenced me in some way, but it didn't affect me or anything like that. When I grew up, I was a total newbie. I made friends very easily and was often the class clown, so teachers often didn't like me. But that was never a problem, because by the next semester, I usually ended up in another state. My friendships were often short-lived, as were the positive relationships I had with teachers. Due to recent events, my memories of one teacher are probably a little skewed, but I will try to describe our friendship as objectively as possible. Mr. Mays was one of my social studies teachers when I was in high school. Now that I'm older, I realize how dangerous it is to deal with kids that age, and I respect her for the way she treats her students. He looked like one of us. He talked like us, made pop culture references, listened to cool music. Sometimes he'd even say "damn" or "hell" when lecturing on American history or something like that. A teacher who swears a little is also a great role model for a freshman. My memories of Mr. Mays are mostly of everything he did. One event that is still vivid in my memory is definitely Halloween, which I attended my sophomore year. Mr. Mays decorated the classroom with the usual teacher decorations, smiling lanterns and black cats, typical and boring for selfish high school students. But on October 31, when most other teachers turned a blind eye to the fact that teenagers were serious about dressing up in Halloween costumes, Mr. Mays took all the teacher coolness to a new level. We walked into the classroom and were surprised to see drawn blinds, small windows draped with curtains, a room lit by candles, and a dim jack-lantern sitting on a stool in front of a desk. Mr. May sat at the desk and watched as the students entered the classroom and took their seats. He didn't even ask anyone to be quiet, because by the time everyone entered the classroom, they were either too excited to pay attention to small talk or too embarrassed to care. As Mr. Mays began his lecture, the students took their seats. He spoke softly to encourage himself and sat down in a chair near a lantern in the middle of the room. "You know, today is probably my favorite day of the year, class," he said in a monotone voice. "Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I want to share with you why I love it so much." One girl had a concerned look on her face. "I'm rescheduling your papers for next Thursday," Mr. Mays said, looking at the girl who slowly lowered her hand to the confused students. The class broke into quiet applause, and Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story as soon as the class quieted down. "I will attempt to recreate the amazing story," Mr. Mays told the class. His telling of this story rendered the rest of the students speechless with horror. The same girl who had raised her hand to ask about the newspaper had her knees drawn up to her chest at the end of the story with an expression of fear on her face. It was important to know what the story was about. At this point, the details have slipped my mind and are not very relevant. I'll try to summarize the most important parts of the story, but don't make me dwell on it. Anyway, after college, Mr. Mays and his friends went on a road trip across the country. They loaded up the truck with camping gear and set out for summer vacation. The group traveled from New Jersey to the Florida coast, from New Orleans to California and Washington State. From there, they traveled to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado before returning to New York City. This vision of freedom instantly captured the entire class. In my opinion, Mr. Mays was the best teacher in the world. As the college students became adventurers, the group did not take a map with them. They didn't have time, so they drove in the direction they wanted to go and eventually found a town or landmark to stay in. He told us that after a week in Colorado, he and his friends had to go through corn, plains, and more corn. They were in Nebraska or Kansas when they decided to pick up some money and spend the night in a hotel. They checked into a motel in some town whose name Mr. Mays couldn't remember when he realized it was near the farm of his grandfather, his friend. He wasn't entirely sure where they were, but being the plucky students they were, they quickly decided to get money from the motel and contact his friend's grandfather. They were unable to contact his grandfather by phone, so the group thought it would be fun to pretend to. Mr. Maker's friend's grandparents believed they would welcome them and not feed them for a moment, so the group took refuge in the cozy house where they lived with sundials. Kansas, Nebraska, or wherever. There aren't many natural attractions that can help lost hikers. Any directions to someone who doesn't live nearby, walk a few miles to the corn, turn right and follow another dirt road to the corn, there is wheat on the right, etc. And then, as happens in most horror stories, the group gets lost. Unwilling to admit defeat, they drove all night, making mistakes every 5 minutes, until they reached a wooded trail where Mr. Mays's friend Mr. Mays thought his grandparents lived. Mr. Mays referred to this road as the dark road to hell. I wasn't entirely sure how true that was, because it was so exciting and a little funny. A tree almost trying to stop the car, and the red eyes of countless animals staring back at them out of the darkness. Even so, most of the class was influenced by the usual horror movies. At this time, everyone was scared. So the group of young people walked down the dark road for about 15 minutes until they came to a clearing that was a small building with a campfire that looked like a bunker. They decided that at least they could help the people living there find where the boys' grandparents lived. An idea that everyone in this provincial corner of the country knew gave him hope. They stopped the car in front of the building, and when they got out of the car, they realized it wasn't a house, but one of those places where you could keep a whole bunch of chickens. Still, the fire was burning, and they decided to give it a try. They approached the building as a whole group, and through a half-open sliding door they found a large empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights illuminated the room like daylight, but there wasn't a soul in sight. There were no cars, but a friend of Mr. Mays said he thought he saw someone approaching the house, so they decided to go in and see if there was an office there and if anything could be done. Otherwise, why else would this large room be so lit up, right? There were no doors inside the building. Again, it was a very large, empty room. So, the group walked around the area and headed towards the bunker. As they got closer, they saw something that looked like a door to the basement. At this point, I remembered Mr. Mays telling the whole class to learn from their own stupidity. He told us that up until that point, He hadn't watched many horror movies and didn't think twice before walking up to the middle of a basement door in a dark, scary, foreign place. He said climbing that door was one of his biggest regrets. Mr. Mays let the whole class know that he was going to tell us about this experience the way he wanted to. He thought we could handle it, but advised the screamer to leave class early. Several students quietly gathered their things and headed for the door. 2 of them were stoned, seeing it as an opportunity to smoke outside the school before the next class. I didn't pay any attention to this message. Like I said, I was a stickler for this sort of thing, and Mr. Mays told the story better than anything I could come up with. I wanted to learn from this guy, even if I didn't believe what he was saying. After the class calmed down a bit, Mr. Mays continued the story. He told the rest of the class that he and his friends opened the door to the basement, and it smelled like the most putrid odor I had ever smelled. The group had not bothered to find the owners of the property, and now decided to find the source of the odor. They walked down the stairs to the basement, lit by a single light bulb scattered haphazardly across the ceiling of the long hallway. No one was talking because everything was very strange. The walls were covered with metal plates that looked like a tubular roof. The corridor itself was crooked, and the ceilings were constantly falling down, like a hastily dug and unrepaired tunnel. There were sections where the boys had to almost bend over to get through. The worst part, Mr. Mace told us, was that the lights were constantly flickering, sometimes acting like strobe lights, making it very difficult to navigate the winding and unstable corridors. In retrospect, he was sure he had fooled his mind, but he remembered seeing glimpses of things that weren't there. He said the mind can do the same thing to you when you focus so hard on something or a nerve. It can show you things or people and go into a rage. Hello, friends. So I wanted to take a quick break before the second half of the story to thank you all for listening to Fear of Fear. If you're a new listener, welcome to be, and if you're a longtime fan, thanks for stopping by the podcast. It would be great if you could take the time to give me an evaluation and review of the show. If you have stories you'd like to submit for future episodes, you can email them to bish.buster@gmail.com. That's bish.busta@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening to me, and without further ado, here's the rest of the story. He continued to describe the hallway, and at this point I was on the edge of my seat. The hallway was windy and seemed like it would go on forever. Mr. Mays thought they were under the woods they were walking through when they found a door somewhere, but he wasn't sure. According to him, after walking about a mile, they came upon the door. It was plain and wooden, but it looked like a country house. It had good trim, it looked like it had just been painted red, and it held and knocked perfectly. It was the entryway door of a nice house, not some dirty tunnel. His friend moved toward the door, moving cautiously because of the flickering light and uncertainty about the strength of the surrounding walls. He turned to the group. The others were nervous, to say the least, and tried to lighten the mood with a laugh before he spoke. Maybe we should knock first. Mr. May's friend grabbed a steel hammer and knocked on the door several times with it, mockingly saying quietly, "Is anyone here?" Home. The group waited for about 30 seconds before the tension subsided. The young man standing at the door flinched and went to his friends, but at that moment, a light bulb lit up and exploded between them. The boys closed their eyes and looked at their lone friend in the doorway. As he lowered his arms, one of the metal sheets of the artificial roof fell. The edge of the table landed right on the boy's forehead, cutting him, and a wave of blood ran down his face. The impact apparently knocked him off his feet, and he fell back towards the door, opening it in the process. The whole group rushed to their friend through the dim light, some sort of black room in front of them. Mr. Mace was the first to turn to his friend. He lifted the young man's head in his arms, immediately taking his jacket and applying it to his forehead to stop the bleeding. When everything subsided, Mr. Mays noticed that the hand resting on his friend's head was wet. He was shocked and was trying to understand the situation when his friend told him. He said something like, "Light, we should go," and Mr. Mays noticed it. So, do you know when the lights go out? He told the class. Everything is almost black except for a burned out or blown out light bulb. That was true, but there were too many of them. At least 20 bulbs had lit up the room a few seconds ago, but now they were like little stars in the dark. Sure, it was scary, but that wasn't the worst of it. There was a very dim light coming from the hallway behind them, and although it was faint, it illuminated the room enough to make out the plans of dozens of people less than 10 feet in front of them. Mr. Mather's friend was about to say something more when suddenly one of the lights on their right came on. Let me pause for a moment. Mays was a real playboy. He had a voice that made you want to answer him. He would basically say, "Guys, let's jump off the cliff." And you'd say, "Okay, Mr. Mays, lead us." I know that's a ridiculous statement, but I hope it makes sense. He was a charismatic guy, and until then the whole story was told as a fiery tale. His voice was mysterious and menacing, like a man's voice, working but noticeable. But in that moment, I remember, it changed completely. He was no longer trying to scare anyone. I could tell that this role came very hard to him. Either he was a great actor, or he had a terrible memory. He told us that a light bulb came on and illuminated the group of people in front of him. In the darkness, he could see children, at least 20 of them. They were all dressed in tattered nightgowns and had something painted on. Their hair was long, and each of them looked like they hadn't had a haircut since birth. Some of the children were completely hidden by their length. All of them looked as if they had never washed or bathed in their lives. Mr. Mays told us that the worst part was that none of the children moved. They were all standing, most of them only visible in the faint light of their eyes. The whole group was paralyzed with fear when they heard an animal roar a few seconds away. It sounded like a whining dog multiplied by 10. When the kids started to come forward, it galvanized the group. The friends grabbed the injured man, and in a flash he was dragged from the room into the hallway. It took Mr. Mays another second to move, and he struggled to get his bearings. He reached to his left, trying to find a wall to lean on, but finally found a knob and pulled hard, keeping his eyes on the children. He hurried to the door when he saw what he was holding. A shower head sticking out of the cement wall and extending about a foot deep into the room. Something was leaking from it too, but it was too dark to make out exactly what. He realized it was leaking, but he didn't care. The children ran toward him in confusion. The animal howled in the distance, and his friend was seriously injured. As he left the room, he noticed he could see a few more shower heads, especially on the wall near the light bulb. Yes, that is why they are called showers, Mr. Mays told the class. I sat down at my desk and leaned forward, waiting to see what would happen next. "I knocked on the red door in the back," he said, and ran down the hall. "I got in the car and we drove like hell." At the word hell, a couple students screamed. "So, when you go out today, make sure you know exactly where you're going, okay? Don't visit abandoned farms. I don't think many of them are like that, but you're all smart kids. Except Jerry." The class laughed at this, and the mood improved when the bell rang for recess. Mr. Mays lit the fire, thanked everyone for their attention, reminded us of the work to be done next week, and wished us a happy and safe Halloween. The surrounding students thought about the story they heard. "This must be some crazy Nazi asylum," one girl said. "I think they were all killed by a dog," said another, and I couldn't guess anything. The way Mr. Mather told the story and the details he included made me feel like I didn't understand the whole story. A few days later, I was late for class and asked her how it ended and what happened to her friend. He laughed and whispered that his friend was fine, and honestly, it probably had to do with some drugs they were on at the time. Mr. Mays looked at me like he'd never told anyone about drug addicts. I smiled and walked away. I lived in that city for a few more months, and then I was quickly transferred across the country to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As I got older, I changed the story and told it about the bonfires, and it was always a success. But I changed the ending so that my friend would lose blood or have children. It wasn't until college that I had the opportunity to talk to Mr. Mays again, I went to college in upstate New York, but not for reasons related to this story. College was a fun time for me, and I remained the same winded person I had always been. During my freshman year, I often ran into Mr. Mace at the bar. At first, I couldn't believe that the man I saw lying on the bar with his arm was Mr. Mace. The only detail that caught my eye was the sweater he usually wore to class on his birthday. "I'm the birthday boy," the sweater said. I told my friends to get a table, and I joined them in a second, then went to the man at the entrance. "Mr. Mays?" I said, and the man looked up. The man looked at my face for a second, then smiled and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Hey son, how you doing?" His eyes, he was about to die and probably didn't know who I was. "Mr. Mays, this is Jack. I was your student for 2 semesters, about 6 years ago." His face changed slightly, and there was an expression of genuine recognition on it. He took a calmer tone and said with a smile, "Yes, I remember. How are you doing, Jack?" We talked for a full 20 minutes. I told him what I had been doing for the past few years, and he did the same. Apparently, he taught at the same school he named. I asked him if everything was okay, and he said it was as it was, and never would be. It took me a while to realize I was an adult. Every time I had interacted with Mr. Mace, it had been a student-teacher relationship. But now I was just a guy drinking with a friend at the bar. Eventually, my friends left and I continued to drink with Mr. Mace. He told me about his divorce and his kids, things I had never asked or cared about before. But now I cared. He wasn't just an idol to me, he was a real person. This was a truly troubled young man, not the misguided teacher I used to think he was. It was several hours before I told the story of the shower. I told him about my history, urban legends and scary stories, and he laughed. He felt uneasy as he remembered a story told years ago. He finished his whiskey, moved some more, then turned to me and became very serious. "Look, Jack, I don't know why I'm telling this story, year after year after year. Either his words were inaudible, or my hearing was impaired. But at the time, we were both confused. A therapist had advised me to do this when I was younger. I had to tell people I was fucked up or shit." He took a big gulp. "Wait, your therapist?" I said. Mr. Mays laughed heartily and looked at me. "Of course he is, Jack. Don't you think something like that would break a man?" I was shocked, but I smiled anyway. Things had gotten really weird. "But you said you were all drug addicts or something, right? Nobody got hurt. You guys were doing well, weren't you?" In the next few seconds, he turned into a sad caricature of himself. "Of course, Jack. Why do you think I'm here now?" I was shocked and was quickly asked 1,000 questions, but I let him continue. "Tim, his mother, he couldn't have done it." He laughed. Her laughter was suddenly replaced by tears. "They took it away. They took it. I don't even know. The cops said we were drunk. He got lost and was carried off by wild animals. He didn't know. He didn't see it, Jack. I was completely stoned at that point. Mr. Mays talked as if I knew the whole story, but I didn't. His friend was gone. At least they'd find the body. Then we could show them. He didn't say a word. This is a bad place, Jack. I don't know what else to say. It's a bad place." He talked for a few more minutes about his friend and how much fun they had before the trip. I let him talk. After a few minutes, his cell phone rang. "Hi, honey." He whispered it into the receiver. Yeah. I'll be out in a second. It's a good one. I love you, baby." The caller hung up, and Mr. Mays got up to leave. "You know, it was good to see you, Jackie. You got a good head on your shoulders, boy. Don't forget to use it, okay?" He started walking out of the bar. "Mr. Mays," I shouted after him. "Yes, Jack?" He turned to me again. "Where would you say this shower incident took place?" "Where?" "Well, I didn't say that, did I? Near Broken Bow, Nebraska? Damned if you want my opinion." Waving me off, Mr. Mace hit the wall, but eventually found the door. That's the last time I saw him. I'll never be able to tell him how much of an impact he had on my life, or rather, how much of an impact his story will have on me. He'll never know about the trip we took after school, almost the trip he and his friends took. He will never know that what he sees there is real. Why? After about a month, his liver failed. But it turned out okay because his family was in the hospital room with him. He died surrounded by people who cared for him, and that's all you could dream of. But I had the opportunity to visit this place a few years later. This is actually where my story unfolds. Below, I will tell you how I found these souls, and why I will never go to Nebraska. I will finish this story when I sober up. I'm still short on memory. Hey friends, it's Buster. Thanks for coming on this episode of the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I would really appreciate it if you would share this new podcast with your friends, family, and on social media. Thanks again for listening, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Hello, friends, Beekeeper. Before this episode starts, I want to thank Castbox for providing me with the original movie Fear that they did with Studio 71. Castbox is the fastest-growing top-rated podcast app on iOS and Android, where you can find your favorite podcasts. Personally, I think Castbox is the best platform for podcasts, and I hope you guys give it a try, because I think you'll be surprised at how many different podcasts they have and how user-friendly their app is. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys. Let's get started. Shower Clover 1176, Part 2. So, I'm awake, hollow, and ready to finish this for you guys, the internet, and anyone else who wants to hear it. I didn't realize that Mr. Mays was gone for months after the funeral. I was going to reach out to his family first and offer my condolences, but Mr. Mays and I weren't the best of friends, so I gave that up. I went to college and graduated about a year after we met at the bar. I graduated with a degree in English, but that wasn't a mistake as it didn't allow me to get a job quickly. I saved a lot of money during my studies and earned a little vacation, if you will. With my spare money, I packed up my college friend Steve, packed my bags, and headed somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. When I was young, I lived near Littleton, Colorado, and I loved it. And I remember how much I loved that place, so this destination couldn't have come at a better time. The trip was a success. We made it to Estes Park, Colorado, and found a cheap cabin that we rented for about a month. The days were filled with laughing, hiking, and other activities that required little from us. After our lease was up, we packed up and headed back east. During this trip, we met a few people at one of the local bars. We don't usually interact with them or anything like that. From time to time, we would discuss drinks and food. One night, these guys paid and got ready to leave very early. Usually, they stayed until dawn. When we asked them about it, they said they were going to a small meeting with a friend and invited us. There was nothing else to do, so we jumped in the car and followed them. The plot itself was pretty low-key and ultimately irrelevant to the story, but most importantly, at some point in the night, we all sat around a campfire and told ghost stories. At this stage of my life, I was no longer as passionate as I had been in my youth. But after getting a little encouragement, I started telling some of the stories I had told in my youth. I finally got to Mr. May's story about the soul. Having heard from Mr. May, I livened things up a bit, but out of unconscious respect for my former teacher, I went along with the version he told my class my sophomore year of high school. The group generally liked my stories, which were common among shower party goers. Steve and I went to the cabin at 5 in the morning, and when we got home, he asked me about the incident. I told him about Mr. Mays and that class and my love of all things horror and such, and he suggested we find this place on our way back to New York. I resisted at first, because I didn't want to wander aimlessly around Nebraska all day, so I looked for a dilapidated old farm building. But a few days before we left Colorado, I told Steve that it was a lot of fun. We won't be able to do a trip like that for a long time, so I thought we might as well make the most of it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought it would be a small tribute to Mr. Mays, the man who, looking back, helped me realize I wanted to be a writer. Anyway, we left Colorado and began the long, boring, and fruitless journey to Nebraska, or as Mr. Mays called it, hell on earth. We found a motel in town and stayed there for a few days, driving about 100 miles one way each day. I remember that Mr. Mays was outside Broken Bow for us, but I don't think he showed us anything. We tried to ask the townspeople if they had any information about the soul. But when we tell them what they do, they usually look at us blankly or roll their eyes. The only person who knows nothing about it is an elderly woman who works at a gas station on the outskirts of town. I don't remember her name, but the woman was one of those older people who was very sympathetic and usually interested in what someone was saying. Steve talked to him at the counter and asked for our number, noting that we were too far from home. We had nowhere else to go, so Steve and I talked to the woman for about 15 minutes. At this point, we started talking about finding a place called The Shower. At first, the name didn't raise any questions for the woman, which made sense since that was the name Mr. Mays had given after his experience there. But as I began to describe the details I remembered from his story, I was interrupted by a friendly owl. His tone was not contemptuous or angry, but from that moment on he became very tense and unhurried in his words. "You don't do that sort of thing here," he said. It had all been a long time ago. After saying that, he tried to cheer up again, asked to use the restroom, and wished me luck on the way back to New York. Steve and I walked back to the car without saying a word. We both thought about the woman's words. Again, he didn't seem angry. He just didn't want to hear another word about it. We were heading back to the hotel when Steve said something. "If I had to live in an urban legend or something, I wouldn't tell anyone about it," he said. "You're tired of people, aren't you? And then you try to scare them and shut them up, don't you?" I agreed with Steve and kept going, but the whole experience made me nervous. If there is such a legend in this area, why doesn't anyone in town know about it? But I was able to push that thought away, which meant that none of us were afraid of finding showers. This little excursion in our journey felt like a rough patch, the end of a shared vacation. Steve and I were basically tourists heading to a famous place where a movie was being filmed, or something like that. We almost didn't find that hope, and it was a long-held hope that we would find the place. We spent another day in Broken Bow before finding showers and heading out on our next trip. Nebraska isn't as scary a place as people make it out to be, but there's nothing really interesting about it. We found a bar, spent some time there, and that was the end of our weekend. When we hit the road again, we tried to stay off the main roads as much as possible. I knew this place couldn't be off the highway, and I remembered some details about the dirt road from Mr. May's story, and we started looking for it. But it was a vain attempt, as most of Nebraska is dirt roads. It was 7 o'clock in the evening when we came upon a small but dense forest. I used the term cautiously, but for Nebraska, this place was like an oasis. The trees were lush and thick, shrouding the entire space in darkness. The sun was setting, and although we came across a few of these random groves a few times, we thought this forest was more promising than others. There was no road, but there was a trail where there had once been a dirt road, and we followed it. If the car can handle the Rocky Mountains, a dirt road in Nebraska would give us no trouble. We drove this road slowly and carefully, taking care to clear the road of fallen trees and rocks that could render the car useless once the sun went down. It was dark here during the day, but when night came, it was a different story. By this time, we had found a suitable spot for us, but we didn't feel like setting it up, so we continued on our way. I didn't realize it at the time, but as Mr. Mays recalled, it was the tiny light that could filter through the canopy of the miniature forest, as if the tree branches were trying to drag the car away. However, I'm pretty sure he was the one who did the animal eyes part. The most aggressive creature I saw in the woods was a dead rabbit on the side of the trail. There were no signs of death on it. It was as if it had been lying there and hadn't bothered to get up. We walked for a long time in one darkness or another before we found a clearing. We had to move some small branches out of the way, but there was a large dead maple tree right in front of the exit. We couldn't move it, so we got out of the car and turned on the headlights, hoping they would illuminate the space ahead of us. When I saw what was about 50 feet from the clearing, I felt excitement mixed with fear. It turned out to be an old house with a barn, partially illuminated by headlights and crescent moonlight. This was no ordinary farmhouse. It was bigger than the barns I'd seen in the movies, and it had no fence. In fact, it looked like a small warehouse. I wasn't completely sure if this was the exact place we were looking for, but it was the closest we could get. I drove through a clearing about 20 miles from the entrance, and then the whole bush seemed to stop. I don't know if the owners did something to the soil, but there is a curb around the entire building with no vegetation on it. I was approaching the front of the building, near the big sliding door, when Steve came up behind me with 2 flashlights in his hands. "You ran in here in the dark?" He laughed. I waved half seriously and took one of the flashlights from his hands. I had a small but fairly bright flashlight. Usually you tie it to your backpack at night or something, but it worked. I grabbed the metal door with both hands, clamped the flashlight in my mouth, and reached out. It moved a little, fidgeted a little, but I couldn't help myself. Steve came up behind me, put the flashlight down, held the door open, and said, 1, 2, and 3. We pulled the door as hard as we could, but when we managed to move it a couple inches, it must have been re-glued, because it slid open very easily and stopped with a loud clanking sound when it was fully open. Steve followed me with a flashlight. At this point, I managed to get inside. Inside, the structure was surprisingly empty. I wasn't entirely sure how far we were from the nearest house or small town, but there was no sign of anyone living in the building for years. There were no broken beer bottles or empty purses. There were no thirsty animals or thirsty plants. The place was spacious, bigger than the average farmhouse, but not the monstrous warehouse I think Mr. Mays described in his story. I don't know if it was a farm equipment storage room or something like that. In desperation, I walked down the hallway in the dark. As I visualized the details of the story, something hit me like a sack of bricks. In Mr. Mays' story, there was a silo near the barn. I ran outside, my eyes adjusting easily because at least it was brighter outside. I looked around and ran around the perimeter of the building. Surely, if there was ever a bunker here, there must be footprints somewhere. But contrary to my hopes, there was nothing on one side but thick bush, clean and dirty, and the forest from which we had come. Disappointed, I walked back into the building. Steve was still excited and excitedly ran inside the building. If we could find a shower head or a pipe, we knew it was right. "Keep looking with me, okay?" I didn't want to upset her. I told Steve the story a few times, but he must not have realized the place was wrong. Yeah, the building was weird. It wasn't out of place, and it wasn't weird, but it wasn't the kind of place that had showers. I let him walk around for a while before calling him. "Well," I said, "this is the closest we can get." But it wasn't. "Remember the bunkers?" His face changed from happy to sad at the same time, like a little boy who didn't get the birthday presents he deserved. I strapped it on my shoulder. "But it's really cool. We can still tell the people we found." I quickly reverted to my old habits. Steve laughed. "Yeah, that's what I think. It's certainly enough. We can even take some pictures as proof." I agreed with him. "I'll get my camera soon, okay?" he said, walking out of the building. I was there by myself. When I was alone, it was very quiet. I could hear Steve running through the bushes to the car, but when he was far away, everything went quiet. I remember walking in the dark with a flashlight in my hand and not hearing any wind or crickets. I believed there must be something here. As I approached the far corner of the room, the sound of my footsteps on the dirt was interrupted by a soft thud. "Hello, friends. This is B. Buster. I have some news for you." I was recently contacted by a listener and offered listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial. All you have to do is browse our unrivaled selection of audio programs without fear of being shorted by Audible.com. Download the title for free and start listening. It's very simple. All you have to do is go to Audible.com and find over 500 scary or frightening lyrics to get started today. You can start by using dot, slash, or SSR at 500,500. As you know, audio content includes audiobooks, original audio shows, news, comedy, and more. Includes leading audiobook publishers, broadcasters, artists, magazine and newspaper publishers, and business information providers. In fact, the trilogy of books I can recommend to all of you is Justin Cronin's Transition books. Of course, you can pick any book you want, but if you're a horror fan, I think you'll especially enjoy this series. And the best part about using Audible is that you can listen to books like the Passage trilogy at work, at school, while cooking, running, at the gym, anywhere. That's what makes audits so great. The convenience they offer is second to none, and when you add some of the best audiobooks on the planet and a fantastic phone app, trying their 30-day free trial is easy. Besides, your books will stay yours. With the Audible, you can go back and listen to them anytime you want, even if you cancel your membership. So I hope you'll take advantage of this generous offer and give Audience a try today. And without further ado, here's the rest of the story. I've been trying to figure out what it is. I stomped my foot and heard that sound again. I realized that the floor I was standing on was covered with something hollow. I walked over to the living room wall and examined the floor carefully, trying to find any holes or cracks. For all I knew, this thing was sitting on solid ground, so I found a trap door or a basement or something. I heard Steve yell back from the bushes. "Hey, Steve, come here. There's a gap here." When I blurted that out, I jumped up a little, hoping to recreate the sound he'd hear coming through the door. But as soon as my feet touched the floor, I felt him give in beneath me. My memories of the fall are hazy, but I remember hearing the crack of wood. I remember Steve's flashlight falling into total darkness. The fall wasn't long, but I must have been in a terrible state because I know I lost consciousness for at least a few seconds. When I woke up, I looked up at the bright light. For a moment I thought I was approaching the fairy light at the end of the tunnel. I was angry with myself. Did you die in Nebraska, Jack? Wow, you know how to screw up. My self-deprecation finally sounded like Steve's voice. Jack! 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 Can you hear me? Wake up! Please, boy, you need to wake up, he said, falling into the pit. I managed to lift my head off the floor, just so he could feel it. The pain in my head was excruciating, but it was relieved by the pain coming from my knee. I knew I had a concussion, but the pain in my knee was much worse. I looked around until I found a small flashlight, then sat up and reassured Steve. I'm fine, man. I hurt my knee. I hit my head so hard, man. Thank God, man. I thought you were dead. Imagine that. Dead in Nebraska. That would have been very dangerous. His words made me laugh a little, but I stopped. A slight shiver gave me a headache and surprised me. I think we need a rope, don't you? Said Steve. What? I asked quietly. Should I get a rope to get you out of here? Or do you see a ladder or something? I looked at the walls in front of me. They were made of smooth cement. I couldn't get out of here. Yeah, get the rope, I told him. Him. I think it's hidden underneath everything. It might be in my red climbing bag, but I'm not sure. Steve nodded and told me to hang up and come back soon. Then he ran off. The silence after that was awkward. When the sound of Steve's footsteps on the floor above me died down, I heard a stirring that arose in the silence and connected with the throbbing in my head. I walked over to the nearest cement wall and leaned against it, resting and breathing deeply, trying to calm myself down. The cement felt unnaturally cold against my back. It was summer, so I was only wearing a t-shirt, but even that looked icy. Again, this observation was made ex post facto. It was nice to have something to lean on at that moment. I waited for Steve in that basement, feeling awkward. I felt like an idiot for falling down here. I was in pain from my injuries. But it all seemed to come together for a moment when I heard what could only be described as left breathing, and for a moment I was convinced my traumatized mind was playing a cruel joke, repeating Mr. May's story before my mind made an instant decision. When I first heard it in class years ago, I was impressed rather than frightened, but now sitting in a dark basement in the middle of Nebraska, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. It can't even be described with the word fear. Sitting there, I felt awful. I pointed the flashlight to the left and I thought I heard a voice. The light didn't reach the other wall. It was too far away. But I was comforted by the fact that there was absolutely nothing there. I took a few more deep breaths before I heard another sound in the darkness. It was so fast, and I can't believe my body moved unnoticed by me, but I thought I heard a scraping sound no more than 10 feet in front of me. It was like the sound of your feet when you walk on a dirt floor. Before I could react, I heard breathing from my left side, closer this time. This can't be real, can it? I hadn't seen a single spider web in this building, and now I'm sure there's something breathing next to me. I was angry at myself for being so excited. I told myself that the human mind is always prone to hallucinations. I told myself that in silence or darkness, the brain will make sounds to fill a void or make you think or see things that aren't there. I turned to my inner skeptic for reassurance. It worked. It worked until I saw something flicker in front of me. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but I heard footsteps on the floor and I began to be overcome with fear. I decided it was best to turn off the flashlight at this point, thinking that if they couldn't see me, they wouldn't be able to get me. Who are they? I turned off the flashlight and was left in total darkness. The flashlight bulb faded as it got cold, so I put it in my pocket and pressed myself against the cold cement wall to stand up. I could walk, but found I couldn't stand, and put any weight on my injured knee. I rounded the corner, heard myself, and tried to break the deafening silence. I yelled at Steve as loud as I could, but there was no response. He was probably in the back seat of the car, still searching for the rope. There had to be a ladder somewhere or something to get out of here. I continued to shake, and my pulse, which had been popping out of my chest, had slowed to an acceptable level. I moved along the cement wall, bracing myself against it with my whole body and not putting any weight on my injured knee. I felt 10 feet up when my head touched something in front of me. I fell to the ground. The concussion must have made the pain worse because he was blind. I reached up with both hands to my forehead when I felt something warm and wet between my fingers. I looked for a cut on his forehead but couldn't find it. I frantically searched for a flashlight, sat up and tried to push myself against the wall. I held the flashlight in my right hand and pressed the other against the wall. I turned it on and pointed it toward the darkness where I still lay. The floor was wet, but the dirt had darkened to the color of the liquid. When I saw another drop fall into the pool, I tried to focus my eyes on the puddle, trying to convince myself it was my own blood. Words cannot describe my words when I heard the sound of a drop and saw another small ball of liquid fall into the pool. As for me, at that point I knew exactly what the source was, but I was trying to convince myself that I was wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at the source of the liquid. There was a pipe looking at me, at least a foot away from the concrete wall. The metal was rusted and cracked, and even small droplets of liquid were starting to seep out. And at the end of the pipe was a simple shower head pointing into the ground. Do you know that feeling when your stomach twists? At this point, I think I threw up immediately. It landed on my shoe, but it didn't matter at that moment. I ignored the pain in my knee and walked as fast as I could along the wall. I heard noises, but I couldn't tell for sure if it was the sound of my movement or something else around me. I managed to slip under a shower head that was higher up on the wall, and the same liquid seemed to be flowing out of it as the previous one. It seemed to me that something endless was going on. Every now and then I had to run or pass under another metal rod, another shower head. I immediately remembered how Mr. Mays had described it. I grabbed my shirt, covered my nose, and kept walking, but that didn't stop the smell for a moment. He looked like he was about to throw up. It was like a cradle. It was like burnt hair. It smelled like decay. Landing on some sort of outlet, I still walked quickly towards the wall. I hit the ground hard, adrenaline flowing through my veins, but the pain still came. Still holding the flashlight in my hand, I headed over and surveyed the area. There was a door in front of me. Even though it was old, there was a door. It had a beautiful design on it, a doorknob and a hammer that made the sound of a demon knocking. The red paint came off and peeled off and fell to the ground in front of me. I clumsily stood up and shot through the door, barely missing the piece of metal plate hanging in front of me. Now I was walking. There was nowhere to run. The walls and ceiling were covered in metal that you would see on the roof of a farmhouse. Large chunks of wood seemed to bind the plates together, cementing this tunnel together. I couldn't risk tripping over them and cutting myself in the middle or crashing into the wood and falling, so I walked on. It felt like a mile, bumping into walls and then wriggling like a snake. I didn't know where I was in relation to the hole I had fallen into, but I told myself there was a way out at the end of this road. If I didn't walk, I would be worse off. In some parts of the tunnel, the ceiling fell 3 meters off the ground. It didn't collapse because the roof was still standing. Someone had built it that way. This is another one. I was ignored at the time. I pretended there was nothing behind me, but I heard footsteps a few inches away. My jeans grazed my legs, and I felt like someone was touching me. Even now, I wasn't quite sure who it was. I made it all the way to the top. I waited with joy. It was the door to the basement. The door was made of wood. I knew this because I could see the lights around them. I wasn't sure, but I thought it might have been car headlights. Besides, I was glad to find a way out. I turned to the door and leaned my shoulder against it. He flinched, but didn't open it. I started to scream, but my throat hurt. The hardest part was the crying. Honestly, it was like a dead animal crying. I collapsed from exhaustion and pain, looking at the lights in front of me. I was so close to getting out of here that I felt it. In a moment of silent defeat, I heard movement in the tunnel. It felt to him like something was dragging him across the floor. He moved, stopped for a second, then moved again. There was nothing left in my stomach to vomit, but I began to choke. I somehow pulled myself together and tried to straighten my arm to point the flashlight into the tunnel. But what I saw, I still can't explain it rationally. I know what I saw, but I can't convince myself that it really happened. I can't stop telling myself it's a hallucination. I saw a child in dirty pajamas. The clothes were stained with a dark brown substance, sometimes purple in color. The child was very faint, like a picture of a Holocaust victim or something. I could only make out the beam of a flashlight between 2 large mounds of long, dirty hair. They reached the child's fingertips, covered in dirt. Boy or girl, I'm not quite sure which one I'm going to match. He wasn't breathing heavily, but every movement of every muscle seemed to take all of the child's strength. But it was the eyes that struck me the most. My flashlight was only visible because of the reflection there. But in that light I sensed anger or deep hatred. Something like that. It was at this point that the English language lacks the necessary words to explain the situation. I realized that this boy wanted to hurt me. Hallucination or not, soul close. I began to cry. He moved closer when he heard a voice behind me. It was Steve, I believed. I tried to respond, trying to say, "Open this and get me out of here." However, given my current state, I'm sure it sounded like nonsense. I pressed myself against the door, pushing it as hard as I could, and finally breaking eye contact with the boy. At the same time, a flashlight fell down the hill and landed somewhere at the boy's feet. "What do you see?" a voice asked me. "What are you talking about?" I closed my eyes. "Just look at him. Tell me what you see." I remember hearing it, but my cries of despair drowned it out. I quietly said to myself, "Relax for a second, I am." That being said, it took a second, at which point I closed my eyes. "Steve, please do this. Please open it quickly," I whispered. "Get me out of here, man." My voice got louder. "Steve, Steve, for God's sake, open the wooden door." Opening my eyes for a second, I saw nothing but black hair in front of my face and a small light hidden in the big hair. I closed my eyes and screamed, using all my strength to open the door. Finally, the door gave in, and I stepped down into the swamp, breathing in the fresh air. My eyes were still closed, but the first thing I did was close the door to the basement and lock it. With that done, I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. In front of me was a barn, illuminated by the headlights of a car. I had a headache and was covered in dirt and liquid, the origin of which I had no interest in. At least my knee was dislocated, but despite all that, I had finally made it out of this tunnel. I took a deep breath, wrapped my arms around my head and said, "Steve, why don't you open the door, man?" I waited for a response, but there was no answer. "Steve, seriously," I started. I was scratching and screaming and fighting for my life, I said, and looked away. At that moment, my stomach must have been on the verge of falling out of me because it moved again. The only thing behind me was the large pile of bushes I saw as I looked around the perimeter of the building. I was pissed. "Steve, now is not the goddamn time. Get out of those weird bushes immediately." I was about to get up when I heard a shout from the side of the building. A flashlight flickered on in the semi-darkness. Steve ran out the open door of the building, shouted my name, and advised me not to worry. I must have passed out then, because when I woke up, Steve was standing over me, trying to wake me up. His words barely made it to my ears. He got me to my feet and we walked to the car, and as I was leaving, I noticed that the flashlight was lying in front of the basement door and the light was off. Steve put me back in the car and drove me to the nearest hospital,